just been discussing President Teddy Roosevelt's approach to Latin American countries, the Roosevelt Corollary, which stated the United States has the right and the obligation and the duty to get directly involved in matters in our own backyard, particularly in Latin American countries. Now, we are going to see how that played out under Woodrow Wilson, because he would sort of, in some ways, ratchet it up a notch. Moral imperialism. Imperialism, of course, is asserting the will of a larger and more powerful country over smaller countries. And this term, moral imperialism, implies that you're not just talking about direct physical imperialism, but something that pertains to morality. Wilson, as I mentioned before, was an extremely religious individual, and he had a religious-like zeal, not just for Christianity, but for democracy. He believed that the United States had an obligation to spread democracy through the world, especially the Western Hemisphere. In fact, here's a quote from him. He said, "I am going to teach the South American republics to elect good men." Well, look at that for a moment. Imagine if you were a South American republic, how would you feel about the president of some other country saying, "You don't know how to elect the right leaders, so therefore we're going to teach you how to get the right people"? Well, no one invited the United States to do that. William Jennings Bryan, who was an anti-imperialist, who had been opposed 20 years earlier to the United States' involvement in the war with Spain, and is now serving as Secretary of State, felt so strongly about his opposition to Woodrow Wilson's approach that he quit his job. And as we saw, he tried over and over and over again to be president, never made it, finally became Secretary of State, but he didn't stay in that job. He quit it. Which leads us to the U.S. involvement in the Mexican Revolution. Now, there had been a previous Mexican Revolution in the 1860s. At the end of that 1860s revolution, the situation was that you had a leader, Porfirio Diaz, who was in place for a very long time as the virtual dictator of Mexico. Technically the president, but he kept getting elected over and over and over and over and over again. In 1910, he faced an opponent, Francisco Madero. By the way, neither of these guys are Diaz or Madero. I'll go ahead and tell you these guys are Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. Anyway, this kind of gets complicated, so try to bear with me as I lay out these basic conditions. Don't feel like you have to remember most of these names other than Villa and Zapata. But what happened in the 1910 election? Francisco Madero had quite a bit of support from the common people. But then when it came time to have the election, lo and behold, Porfirio Diaz had won by huge, huge margins, almost 100% of the vote. Everyone knew that that was not kosher. Everyone knew that was not legitimate. In 1911, Madero, who had the support of a lot of the common people, started a revolution to overthrow Diaz. These two guys were two of his main generals. Pancho Villa, who was in charge of the basically pro-Madero forces in northern Mexico, and Emiliano Zapata, who was in charge of southern Mexico. Eventually, Madero manages to overthrow Diaz. He becomes president, but within a couple of years, he's assassinated. Here's where it starts to get confusing because someone else is involved here. Victoriano Huerta had Madero assassinated, and he takes his place. Now, a new rebel leader arises, Venustiano Carranza, who leads opposition to Huerta. Both Villa and and Zapata also resume their positions as opposition to the dictatorship in power. So, the situation you have in 1913 is you have Huerta, who had assassinated and replaced Madero, who had overthrown Diaz. You have Carranza trying to overthrow Huerta. In the middle of all of this, United States Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson, who represented ultimately not only the United States government, but a lot of business interests as well, got involved. By the way, he's no relation to Woodrow Wilson. Here's what happened. An arms shipment financed by an American arms company that Ambassador Wilson was involved with sends money for Huerta to help support him against the rebels. They could not send these arms directly from the United States. The U.S. technically isn't involved, so they had a roundabout thing where the financing came from the U.S., but the shipment came from Germany. And the shipment was coming in, again, to help the pro-government, depending on whether you thought it was a legitimate government, of Huerta. But there's a problem. The problem is Woodrow Wilson has no idea that his ambassador has made this secret deal and has inserted himself into this rebellion. Wilson is not real fond of Huerta, and when he finds out that these weapons are coming from Germany, he assumes that it's the German government behind it, doesn't realize it's his own government. So he sends the U.S. Navy to Veracruz with many U.S. Marines coming along with the intention of stopping this German ship. So they come and they land and occupy the port city of Veracruz. Here is where one wishes that President Wilson, with his history and political science PhD, had given a little more consideration to history. Okay? Veracruz was where Hernan Cortez landed in the 16th century for his conquest of Mexico. It is where American forces under General Winfield Scott in the Mexican-American War of 1848 landed to invade and conquer Mexico. If you are a Mexican living in Veracruz, seeing Europeans showing up on ships in your harbor has never been a good thing. It has always led to them trying to conquer you. Therefore, although Wilson's forces were there ostensibly to help out, right? The people in the city reacted very angrily to being occupied. And so there was a big battle, 1914, between U.S. forces and Mexican forces there, in which 100 Mexicans were killed and 19 Americans were killed. One individual who shows up in this story is a U.S. Army officer, Captain Douglas MacArthur, who was there as an intelligence officer, distinguished himself in the battle. We'll be hearing a lot more about him. But this whole situation is a really good illustration to show the consequences of Wilson's type of moral imperialism. He had no idea what was going on. No idea whatsoever. In reality, it was his own government that was causing the problem. So by reacting as he did, acting as he did, it caused an indignant, angry, and defensive reaction on the part of the Mexicans there. Eventually, both Villa and Zapata break with Carranza, the rebel leader. They take over Mexico City in 1914. The United States, under Wilson, was backing Carranza. They're supplying him. Pancho Villa, as sort of a statement against U.S. support of Carranza, invades America and raids the city of Columbus, New Mexico in 1916, with several people being killed. The United States then responds by sending a pretty large force, 10,000 American troops, into the American Southwest along the U.S.-Mexico border, trying to catch Pancho Villa. The punitive expedition, it was called. It was led by General John Pershing. Here's Villa again, that's not John Pershing. John Pershing, by the way, known as Black Jack Pershing. We haven't mentioned him before, but remember when I talked about the charge up San Juan Hill and the fact that along with Teddy Roosevelt, there was that black regiment, the Buffalo Soldiers. Pershing was one of the officers of that regiment. That's where he got the name Black Jack. He wasn't African American, but he served with a black unit. So now here he is coming into the story, and he'll be entering our story